Oh, what's going down, APUSH people? We have Key Concept 6.1 for you today. This is from the 2015 revised edition, the most up-to-date version you will find of Key Concept 6.1. Before we begin, it is shout-out time, and I want to give a huge shout-out to Mrs. Sauer's class in Cincinnati, Ohio, the great Queen City of Ohio. I appreciate you guys very much for watching, and best of luck in May. All right, let's take a look at Key Concept 6.1. It states technological advances, large-scale production methods, and the opening of new markets encourage the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. Some big idea questions to focus on. What was the relationship between businesses and government? In what ways did the South change and remain the same during this time? And that will focus on the historical thinking skills of changing continuity over time. You could see an essay question on changing continuity. And finally, how did farmers and industrial workers respond to corporations? Each will have different takes and different reactions to corporations. All right, Roman numeral 1 states large-scale industrial production accompanied by massive technological change, expanding international communication networks, and pro-growth government policies generated rapid economic development and business consolidation. We need to figure out how were new markets opened in North America after the Civil War. Well, we have the government playing a large role in this by providing money and land for the construction of railroads. And an example of this is the Pacific Railway Acts, which gave subsidies, government subsidies, which is money and land, to the Pacific Railway Company. And we see here in 1869 the finishing of the Transcontinental Railroad, where the two tracks converged as one. And also, telegraph lines were often linked with railroads. So where railroad tracks went, telegraph lines did as well. So what were the impacts of these subsidies? Well, we see the growth of farms, cities, and a lumber industry. So the railroads are really going to connect cities and farms and make them more dependent on each other. So businesses increased the production of goods during this time, and they did so in several different ways. We have technological advances. A very important term you should be familiar with is Taylorism, and this was introduced by this guy, Frederick Taylor, that focused on improving efficiency. Workers would have time tasks, and they would have specific tasks as well to do in a certain amount of time. We also have greater access to natural resources, specifically lumber, as I mentioned on the previous slide. And we have redesigned financial and management structures. Now, what that means are things are emerging like monopolies in which businesses sought to have sole control over an industry. So, for example, Rockefeller, with Rockefeller Oil, will eventually gain control as much as 90% of the oil industry in America. We have marketing advances emerging during this time. We have mail order catalogs. Places like Sears and Montgomery Ward, these department stores, they appealed to middle class families and would have these mail order catalogs that could reach farmers out in rural areas. And a growing labor force as well, with a large supply of workers. So all of those were factors that led to increased production of goods during the late 19th century. So what was the impact of this industrial revolution? Well, with the price of goods decreasing because they become more efficiently produced, and workers' wages increase. So workers are making more money. New goods and services emerge. Things like sewing machines, sporting equipment, and other household items become more popular and are introduced. And the American standards of living improved as a whole. However, there was a gap that grew between the rich and the poor. So overall, Americans are more prosperous, but there is a growing gap between the rich and the poor. Business leaders sought to increase profits by consolidating businesses into the following things that you should be very familiar with. Trusts, which are associated with monopolies, trying to gain control of an entire industry, and holding companies in which one company would own stock in several other companies, thus allowing them to control all of these companies. Businesses and policymakers sought markets and resources not only in the U.S. but in other areas as well. For example, the Pacific Rim, we have in Hawaii calls for annexation in the 1890s because Hawaii was a huge producer of sugar and it will eventually be annexed by the United States. Also in Asia, the Philippines will be gained by the United States in 1898, in which period 6 ends, and this is as a result of the Spanish-American War. And in 1899, I realize this is period 7, but still the late 19th century, we had the open door policy in China, in which the U.S. sought to trade freely with China. And in Latin America, we had the Big Brother policy by Secretary of State James G. Blaine, and this helped open up markets to the United States. So the U.S. is not only focusing on domestic markets, but international markets as well. All right, let's take a look at Roman numeral 2. A variety of perspectives on the economy and labor developed during a time of financial panics and downturns. Laissez-faire. This is a very important term, which essentially the government takes its hands off the economy. Now, this became a dominant economic philosophy. This encouraged very little government regulation of industries, and businesses really favored this because the government would not regulate what they can and cannot do. We also have the expansion of the industrial workforce due to internal migration. So domestically, we have farmers moving to cities to work in factories. And we also have this enormous international migration or new immigration. And this is predominantly made up of people from Southern and Eastern Europe. Contrast that with old immigration, which is made up of people from Northern and Western Europe. And we have people from China as well during this time settling on the West Coast. Child labor would also increase because many families relied on children for wages. And this huge supply of workers led to lower wages for workers working in factories. Issues such as labor versus management emerge, and they would battle over wages and working conditions, especially in factories. So local and national unions would emerge to confront businesses. We have major union, the Knights of Labor, led by Terence Powderly, who may have the thickest, most luscious mustache in U.S. history. Look at that monster. And this was composed of skilled and unskilled workers. You need to know the characteristics of this labor union. It was also made up of women and African Americans. Now, their downfall came with the Haymarket Square riot in Chicago, in which this was a large demonstration in which anarchists were there as well. And somebody, nobody really knows who, throws a stick of dynamite, killing and injuring several people, including police officers. Now, the Knights of Labor had nothing to do with the explosion, but they were lumped in with the Haymarket Square riot, so they did not last very long. I do have a video on unions. You can check out in the description with much more detail. After them emerges the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, led by Samuel Gompers, and this was made up of skilled workers only, and it excluded women. And they focused on things called bread and butter issues. They wanted 8-hour workdays, higher pay, and better conditions. And they rarely used strikes. And unions as a whole hoped to improve working conditions and wages for workers. The South begins to industrialize during this time, and it becomes known as the New South. And this term called for increased industrialization in the South, and you see textile factories began to appear in the South. So these factories that were so dominant in the North prior to the Civil War in antebellum America are now actually going to the source of the raw materials in the South. And a leader who called for the New South was Henry Grady, an editor of the Atlantic Constitution. So people are saying, hey, the South should industrialize as well, and they do during this time. However, sharecropping and tenant farming remained throughout much of the South. And this is when people would rent land, and the payment land would be in the form of cash if you're a tenant farmer, or in crops if you are a sharecropper. And many African Americans were sharecroppers throughout the 1800s. Continuing with Key Concept 6.1, Roman numeral 3 states new systems of production and transportation enabled consolidation within agriculture, which, along with periods of instability, spurred a variety of responses from farmers. So we have an increase in agricultural production, mechanized tractors, reapers, etc. They allowed for less reliance on animals and allowed for faster cultivation of crops. They were steam powered and then eventually gas powered. Grain elevators were used to store crops and transporting to railroads more easily. And this is a grain elevator from my home city of Buffalo. And you see here, it would be right on the water. So ships could come in, they would store the grain here, and then it would connect with the railroad and ship to other parts of the country, or they would ship to other parts of the country. Now, the increased production of goods led to a decrease in food prices. Because the food is being produced so quickly and so efficiently, prices will go down, hurting farmers. So how did farmers respond to consolidation in businesses and railroads, or how did they respond to their plight? They created local and regional cooperative organizations, essentially their own versions of unions. We have the Grange in the 1860s. They sought to bring farmers together to share techniques, and they hoped to elect state legislatures that were favorable to their programs. Granger laws were different state laws that regulated railroads, and these were successful only for a limited time because railroads fell under interstate commerce, which only Congress could control. The Southern Farmers Alliance was mostly a local organization, and they established stores and banks for farmers, and they excluded blacks, so that led to the Colored Farmers Alliance, which was mostly in the southern United States, and that was established to help black farmers in the South. So the People's or the Populist Party, wicked important to know. Make sure you pay super close attention to this. This has been a very popular topic on past AP exams. So this party called for a stronger government role in the economic system. So what were the causes of the Populist Party? Well, you have growth of corporate power, and railroads would charge high rates that hurt farmers. So the People's Party, or the Populist Party, is really going to be made up of farmers. There's also economic instability that's a cause. The panics of 1873 and 1893 hurt farmers. And their goals, they wanted a stronger government role in the economic system, so they're kind of anti-laissez-faire here. And they also want a graduated income tax, which means the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. They wanted the inflation of currency, which would help poor farmers, and free silver, and not using just gold to back up the value of money. And the candidate in 1896 was this dude, William Jennings Bryan, who was a 3-time presidential candidate, and he also in 1896 ran as a Democrat, and he advocated free silver. And for political reforms, they wanted the direct election of senators, and that will come true with the 17th Amendment at a later time period, and government ownership of railroads, telephones, and telegraphs because they felt the companies were abusing their power. All right, let's go over some test tips for multiple choice and short answer. Definitely know the new business structures and their effects. The role of government during this time and the plight of farmers. Focus on the Populist Party and goals of labor unions. Sharecropping as well, make sure you know what that is, and the Populist Party. Holy cow, I can't stress that enough. For essays, you could see an essay comparing the role of government during this time to other time periods and ways farmers and laborers responded to corporations during this time. All right, guys, look forward to seeing you back here for Key Concept 6.2. I do appreciate you watching, and I wish you nothing but the best of luck on your exam in May. Have a good day.